So today we are going to talk about the views of the Europeans about the outer world. So you understand that certainly the views about the world as such, about Asia, Africa, different parts of the world, of course, changed. It wasn't rapidly, right? It was not a rapid change. So we're speaking about a certain period of time, which was called the Age of Discoveries, and probably this is one of the most important milestones in the history of human civilization, of first of all European civilization, because that was the time, that was the age, even the epoch, when people understood that they do not live alone on this earth, and that those who live nearby in the so-called Black Africa or Asia or South Africa and so forth, they also are people, or they are similar to the people, or they are similar to the Europeans. And that is why it is necessary to understand that many cultural and civil phenomena, even legal phenomena that really concern the history of Europe and England and America, I mean the USA, of course the great empires of the 19th century, they all have their roots in this age of discoveries, which we could consider to be, which we could definitely consider to be one of the most important periods of the Renaissance and the early modern age. So the agenda for today, as we have it, includes 3 questions. У нас будет 1,5 часа, да? So first of all, we have to talk a little bit about the rise of historical knowledge, because you understand that to have some orienters, to have some markers, let me say, for the Europeans meant not only to have the definitions of the lands, right, the certain routes to different cultures and different countries, but also the possibility the possibility to understand themselves in history, in time, as a kind of unique civilization. That is why it would be interesting for us to talk about so-called history or philosophy of history or theory of history. The second point is, of course, the discussion of the Age of Discoveries, as I have already said, one of the most important periods of pre-modern time, or early modernity, as some of the investigators put it. And finally, we are going to discuss the emergence of scientific societies in modern Europe, because you understand that this institution of scientific society plays an important part in contemporary and, in modern, in general, structure of the very rationality and science as such. So we have already said at our first lecture that one of the characteristics of science is, of course, the institutionalism in terms of the certain academies, scientific schools, then universities as the places where the knowledge could be gained and the degrees could be obtained. That is why it could be interesting for us to have this have this observation of the emergence of scientific societies, mainly in the very beginning of modernity, so that is about 17th century. So to speak about the rise of historical knowledge, we have to coin, first of all, the term of secularization. We have already discussed that at the first lecture, as far as I remember, but still we have to mention it. So it is an important term, because as a kind of reflection, it has 2 big volumes, right, of understanding, the spheres of understanding. First of all, and initially, let me say, it meant deconsecration. And this term was actually, this term came from the science studies and sociology, when they tried to express and describe such a phenomenon as Reformation. For example, Henry VIII period, Henry the Tudor, who was probably one of the first rulers who tried to put his independence, to found his independence from the Pope, from the Catholic Church. And that is why he really needed a certain area of his influence. Such area were the cathedrals, were their lands, because you understand that, well, the cathedrals and actually the clerical foundation has much property, right? That is why when they got, I mean the state, the rulers, got their land, their properties and so forth, this could be described as deconsecration, or the term was secularization. So those parts of property, or those parts of certain buildings, the certain even the certain laws under which primarily the clerical part of the state really had the peasants and laymen and so forth, turned into the legal system of the state. That is why we meant the first meaning in the social field, and as it is put in the social sciences. The second and more general definition of this term is abandonment of religious assumptions of practices, all practices. So the world becomes more and more lay, more and more secular, as we can put it in English. So probably you know that Karl Marx was one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century, who tried to establish that point of view to the church as such, not only to Orthodox or to Catholic or to Protestants, no, to church as such, to the whole area, right, the whole ecclesiastic area as the great capitalist institution, right? That's actually very illustrious, because he really meant that we do not need to talk about any providence, any high matters, let me say. We do not talk about God in terms of the phenomena in the real world, in terms of how they find their reflections in the inner world. That, I mean, that the king could be considered not the follower of someone who gave him the rule of reigning, but actually as one of the most important capitalists in the present situation. And his thesis, one of his theses in a book, The Introduction to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, says that the critique of the heaven becomes the critique of the earth, and theology becomes philosophy in terms of the matters that we generally referred to, the high matters, to clergy, to the ecclesiastic field, now have historical and, let me say, social roots, right, social foundations. That is why secularization is largely considered to be the objective process, and we can say that we even can regard it to be the global situation, the global process. So we have even different theories of secularization, and it's important to mention that the opposite is clericalism. So when secularization is also considered as the rise of clerical and ecclesiastic sympathies or views in society, and clericalism, right, is considered to be the rise of ecclesiastical and spiritual, right, spiritual views in society, whereas secularization is the increase of it, right, the decrease of it. So concerning the theories of secularization, I just got some examples from our Russian investigator, whose surname is Garaja, and he says about mostly he says about three important tendencies in definition of what it is. So first of all, is secularization as loss of sacred. That means that when we have some temples, we have the cathedrals, we have the institutions where this or that cult is very important and influential, decreases and really falls down as far as time goes on. So you can remember the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, when so in the classic era it was one of the most influential, let me say, temples in the classic world, and from the period of Greek and Persian wars it really declined because it became unpopular, because the Pythia, or the oracle itself, right? They said that that is Apollo, the god, says that you have to give up, right? You, the Greeks, have to give up on the face of the Persian power and Persian force. So this is a kind of an objective process which we can find in different cultures and nations, and even in different situations of certain period of time in national states. So I have already mentioned Karl Marx, who is one of the probably one of the most illustrious prophets of this development, and perhaps one of the most, how to say, one of the most definite example of this secularization in such society we can see as the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the religion was prohibited, right? Mainly, many cathedrals were just closed, many churches were closed, and one of the most important cathedrals for the Orthodox, so-called Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow, it was turned into the swimming pool. The second approach to this understanding of secularization as a certain process is number two. Well, this is a process of displacing faith by science or rational thinking or secular ethics, which really means the changing of attitude to the most important questions that we have in this or that society. So first, in the same Greece, or we can find it in the Roman world, we understand that, or we realize that many ways of how we can behave, and many prescriptions of behavior we find as given by the gods, given by the certain deities. For instance, we can remember Socrates, who had his daimonion, or his demon, as we can say now. And Socrates really thought that this is the power which restricts him, or I could even say keeps him from acting in a lame way. From this point of view, we can say that as more powerful, the more powerful rationalism and the more powerful science we have in this or that nation, or in this or that state, in this or that culture, the less clerical society is. The less number of people want to know their future by the means of deities, by the means of God. The less try to predict, if we speak about the ancient world, or the less number of people want to know what God thinks about them, right? So that is why it is important to remember that Kant's famous thesis about God as the ethical hypothesis is not an opportunity to establish his existence. This is how he thinks we can understand ethics, and ethics is secular, right? And finally, the third theory of secularization, which Garaja puts, is the evolution of religion and its varieties in the course of social development. So that means that secularization is the other side of religious process. So the more people live, the more objectively they know about the universe, the more they know about themselves, the more they understand about their neighbors and the circumstances of their life. And that is why a religious point of view really changes. So we can remember Auguste Comte, a famous philosopher of the 19th century who established such a movement in philosophy and theory of science as positivism, who really said that there are three stages in history of culture, of any culture, and in history of any human mind. The first is religious, the second is metaphysical, and the third is positive or scientific. So he starts from religious in terms as we could compare it as a child understands his or her parents as almighty and omnipotent deities that know everything, that can everything, right, and where we can find the protection. But the more we know and the more we live on this earth, the less we need from the deities, the less we need from God. And finally, in the classic era of rationality, which comes in the 17th and 18th centuries, we find even such a point of view as deism, which we could also describe further. So this is the point of view when we know that we do not need God as a hypothesis to explain how the world works. So here we will find a famous metaphor of the clockwork mechanism, and the most influential physicists and scientists of the 17th and 19th and 18th century will try to explain the world without any figure of God. Not because they did not believe, but because they did not need this hypothesis. So we also have to remember about secularization, because it comes actually from the word seculum. In Latin, you know, it means generation or kin or a certain age or secular world in general. And it is interesting that this term was rather influential if we speak about the periodization of history. So if we have to give some periods or some epochs or ages in human history, we need a certain measure. Nowadays it is century, and century means 100 years, but it was not always the same, because seculum, first of all, meant a certain period of time when this or that ruler reigned, or this or that ruler was in force. For example, one ruler could live for 46 years, the next ruler would live 30 years, the third ruler would live 100 years or something like that. So the length of century, the length of seculum in this point of view really changed, and we cannot find anything definite. For example, in the classic Greek tradition. So when Socrates were asked when was he born, he also said about the Olympic Games, but the second milestone, let me say, the second measure of this period of time, or the temporal process as such, was the ruling of this or that archont. So nearly the 2nd century AD, the Roman historians first tried to use the term secular as a certain period of time with a definite number of years. And it is very important because in the very beginning of modernity, as we have already said that, Chornius and Cellarius first understood that they live in the modern age. So what does really mean the modern age? That means that we have something ancient and something in between, something like Middle Ages, right? From this point of view, from this perspective, we can think that our temporal development in history, our way of living in history is linear. That means that we have a certain idea of progress. So we know more, we can more, we really have the bigger field of investigation comparing to the ancients, comparing to the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians, even the medieval philosophers or scientists and so forth. So this is one and very influential trend in history of philosophy and science in modern period. But another quite influential and really important trend is the one that coined Giambattista Vico, and this could be, so he could be regarded as one of the first thinkers in the field of philosophy of history. So philosophy of history is the term which was coined by Voltaire in the 18th century. So we can never find this term in Giambattista Vico's writings. However, he really was the philosopher of history, and actually his main treatise, his main monography, as we can say, was called The New Science. It was published in 1725, and Vico tried to give a certain perspective, a certain point of view of how we can consider our temporality, how we can find our way, our place in time, not only in space but also in time. So he really thought that we have different civilizations on our Earth which could be distinguished from one another. And this theory, this approach, got the name of cycles of civilizations. So he was rather influential on his predecessors, on his followers, but he was largely unknown among his contemporaries. He lived in Naples, and he was Italian, but really few people read him, and he was very unsuccessful academic career, as well as very unsuccessful private life. But still, he really thought that he is a prophet. He understood that he does something very important for the coming generations, for the following ages and following investigators. That is why we can say that his spiritual followers were mainly the German philosophers Herder and Hamann, as well as famous poet Goethe, and later thinkers such as Nietzsche or Oswald Spengler, who had very, really great influence by Nietzsche. And as far as Giambattista Vico tried to establish this theory of cycles of civilization, we can say that he is the founder of civilizational approach in historical investigations. So what does really philosophy of history means? Isn't it a kind of mixture, a confusion of different terms? We have to say that history is not something objective. I mean, we cannot say that, we live somewhere in history. We can't say that there is something really definite, as we can say, about the, for example, astronomic year or the calendar, right? Because astronomic year really is based, and the calendar as such, really based upon the physical phenomena, the astronomical phenomena. But history is something as we understand ourselves in time. That is why it is very important to know the theory of it. That is why it is important to speak about epistemology of history, if you will. So let us try to observe the main principles of Giambattista Vico's philosophy of history. And probably the first that we have to mention is his so-called anti-Cartesianism and anti-Cartesian tendency that he gives in his works. We have not discussed Descartes yet, and this will be the topic of the following lecture. But still, you know that Descartes is famous not only as philosopher but as mathematician, who has developed a certain mathematical approach to different fields of knowledge, such as, for example, medicine, or even he elaborated the geometrical demonstration as we know it in modernity, comparing to the ancient Greek tradition. So the main anti-Cartesian tendency in Giambattista Vico's approach is that he tried to put his investigation from quantitative to the qualitative one. That means that he tried to escape from measuring, escape from the definition by numbers to the definition by the essence of this or that event or this or that person. So how can we evaluate this or that event? We can measure, for example, how long was this or that war, or how many years this or that ruler lived. But really, we cannot say that if, for example, the World War II lasted for 6 years, right? Or that, for example, I don't know, in ancient, well, the Romans struggled with barbarians more than 100 years, that we can not really compare these two periods of history, right? We can even remember the 100 Years' War, which happened between France and England, but still that it lasted 116 years gives us too little information. That is why Vico says that we have to define and we have to understand and realize this or that event or this or that hero in history from the essential, not the quantitative point of view. The second principle is that history is a science about humans' acts. In different works, in different writings, we can find that history starts from the acts of gods or the acts of this or that heroes. For example, the ancient and classical ancient tradition of Greece and Rome thought that we have to start from the very creation of the universe, so-called theogony. But still, Vico says that only the human beings, only the people are those who create history. So we do not speak about any higher matters here, right? We don't speak about any influence of God on the human development, temporal process, right? We speak about something done, and what is done could be considered to be a fact. So this is a famous verum factum principle. So what is done is equal to what is true. Vico even says that verum ipso factum esse, so which means that something done is really what we can consider to a reliable foundation of our investigation. So if we don't have any phenomenon, if we don't have the object of research, we cannot say that this is really the act. So if we do not have anything from the Roman Empire, as we don't have any, we have very little from the Minosian, for example, culture of pre-Greek tradition. So we can say that, well, the Roman culture is much more historical in this point of view, right? And finally, the third principle is that philosophy is empty without philology, as well as philology is blind without philosophy. So Vico demands for the exact knowledge in terms of history. So what does it mean? What is the link between philosophy and philology? You know that in the Renaissance, after Erasmus of Rotterdam, Thomas More and Egon Reichlin and many other people who established classical philology and the very field of classic investigation, they thought that the only opportunity to understand the foundation of the European culture is to read texts critically. So they first published the Holy Scripture critically. They first published Plato and Plutarch, Aristotle and many others, even the fathers of church, as literal, not holy tradition. And philology became, so by the 17th and 18th century, philology became the area which was regarded as an area of strict knowledge, of exact knowledge. So if you don't know the word, that means a lot. So if you do know the word, it also means a lot, because you can understand that the very problem of translation shows the distance that you have from the certain period of time when people spoke that language, they tried to translate into the modern one. So when we speak in terms of ancient tradition, for example, the tradition of Greece, we remember that, for example, the word knowledge could have different definitions and different translations, which really depend on how we understand this or that aspect of this notion. So as far as we know the definite meaning of this or that word, we can understand what this or that person who really creates history, and you remember that history is science about humans' acts. So we can not only understand his or her actions in history, but we could even predict these or that circumstance that followed his action. We're not speaking about the prediction, the principal possibility of prediction in history, but we are speaking about the opportunity of understanding the heroes of history. So this is crucial. Finally, we have to mention those who were very influential on Vico's understanding of the very idea of history as science, and these are called four authors. So we call them after Vico himself, and they are Plato, Titus Livius, Francis Bacon, and Hugo Grotius. So Plato, you remember, was one of the most influential philosophers of the ancient Greece and one of the main and principal philosophers in history of thought. So Plato was probably the first man who coined the idea that the real world is not the one of the sublunar world, but the world of ideas. So the physical world the physical world has many phenomena, many objects that really change, and we cannot search them, we cannot treat them to gain the real knowledge as such, because everything changes, and these objects of the sublunar world are only the shadows, only the just the aspects of the ideas that are transcendental, right? So from this point of view, Plato is considered by Vico to be the founder of this idealistic, so in terms of ideas, idealistic approach to understanding of truth and to understanding of science as such. Titus Livius was a famous Roman historian, and he gave us many examples of human actions. So when Vico means that history is science about humans' acts, he means mainly that we have to have the examples of these actions, and we need to have chronicles, right? So Titus Livius is one of those who really gave us this possibility to read about famous heroes of history, about famous actions of people, and that is why he's the second author whom Giambattista Vico follows. So Francis Bacon is regarded to be the one who established the empirical tradition in history of science and philosophy. Empirical in terms that he said we have to study the real world, the world that we live in, to understand how science is possible. I mean, what is science? It is, of course, an idealistic question, but how science is possible is not the question to pondering about it, right? It's not the question that we can solve metaphysically. So we have to give the demonstrations, we have to put the experiments, and after delivering successful experiments, we can say that we have proved something or disproved something. So Vico really thought that history is such a field of research where we can give the demonstration of this or that idea, and that we can explain the actions of this or that person, giving the demonstration of how he really thought that it is necessary to act. And finally, Hugo Grotius was an influential Dutch lawyer whom Vico was very in-depth in terms of Grotius was one of the elaborators of the modern law and modern philosophy of state, philosophy of right. So these four people who first of all gave the basis of metaphysical, let me say, metaphysical approach to studies of history on the one hand, and the possibility of demonstrations of these or that actions of the human beings, as well as the understanding that people act only in society. This is the foundation upon which Vico tries to work out his own approach to history. So people really are the heroes of history, and here we can find some quotations from his writings from the New Science, which is could be regarded as opus magnum. So in the dark of the night, among the gloom which conceals the distant antiquity from us, suddenly the external inextinguishable light erupts, the light of indisputable truth that a civil world has been created by men, and they are able, whence they must, to find its origins in the transformations of this very human reason. So, of course, we understand that there is God somewhere, right? And we can believe in God, and we really have to believe, because Giambattista Vico never says that he doesn't believe in God, or that this is a completely secular point of view. But still, we have to realize that how we live depends only on us. That is why it is very important to behave rationally. And rationalism is a certain, let me say, zeitgeist, a certain spirit of time of the 17th and 18th century, where the classical science developed. The second quotation is more interesting. So there is no doubt that this world was born by the reason, which is absolutely different from the one of the humans, and surpasses intentions by the latter by its aims, of the latter by its aims. So that means that he really thinks that the world was created by God, by almighty and omnipotent and omniscient deity, right? But still, we are really responsible for what we do here on earth, and we do not have to pray for anything unless we act in this certain way. So this is not an exception from his idea of the person as hero of history, but this is a certain emphasis that he puts on our responsibility for our actions. So we also have to mention that this, that this heterogeneity of the purposes that we have in Vico's works means that different purposes of the human being could not contradict the purposes of the deity, because deity is omniscient and person is restricted in his scientific approach, in his rationality. That is why we have the idea of providence in history, but still we are able and we must behave in our own rational way. So, how do we behave? And what does it mean that person is really responsible for the development of history? Vico says that there are three ages of history, which are the age of gods, the age of history, the heroes, and the age of people. So this principal diversity of ages and this approach to give the periodization of history has the basis on the understanding what happens in this or that period of time. So in the first age is the epoch when people still possess half-beast existence. So we can say that this is one of the darkest period of human history. What does it mean? Primarily, it means that when the very history of civilization began, people did not understand how to act and how to behave in this world. So they really thought that the world is full of gods and they have to worship them, and they have to be responsible not for their actions, but their worshipping. So they also did not understand that the humans are those who have rationality. That is why they were very essential. And Vico even says that in this period of time, the brute sensuality prevails. So I want, and that means I act. So the more I want, the more actions I do, right? And the more stronger feeling I really have to this or that thing, to this or that object, the more definite action I can provide. So, of course, this is the very first step in the history of human beings. The second is the epoch when fantasy prevails reason. So the one who has fantasy could not be regarded as beast anymore, and we can even say that this is the age when person realizes that deities not only omnipotent and omniscient, but they also need the mediators, right? The mediators that or transmitters of their will. So the heroes occur, the heroes appear. So these are people who are not people as all the others, right? So they are probably stronger, they are wiser, they are probably have some supernatural possibilities, but still they are not gods themselves. As we can say, for example, Odysseus, right, or Ulysses, as he was called in Latin tradition, is this kind of hero, or Hercules, or Achilles. So all these people are heroes, and they are half gods and half people. Of course, they give us the example of the struggle of violence, and that is why Vico says that this is quite violent period of time. But still, they have fantasy, which of course prevails reason, but still their reference to gods is completely different from the one we can find on the first stage, on the first step of development of human history. And finally, the third, so it's written the second, but still it's third age, is the epoch of comprehensive reason. So this is the time when people really try to establish the legal and civil institutions, and this is the period of time when people realize that they live in society. You remember Aristotle's formula that the person, the human being, is a social animal, the political animal as such. So this is the period of time, this is the epoch when the human beings tried to act not only towards nature or towards gods, but towards each others. So we have to say that, of course, language was very influential engine, even one of the inner powers of this development. So language was the foundation of poetry, and poetry, you understand, is a certain field of creativity, of human spirit, that gives us the possibility to express our fantasy. And the second age is famous for having many poets and many playwrights, such as Homer and Aristophanes and Sophocles and many others of them. Finally, when we are on the stage of comprehensive reason, myth appears, but we do not have to understand myth as a fable, as a fairy tale. Myth is a certain possibility to explain how the ancients lived. And one of the most illustrious examples of this mythological approach, let me say, to the explanation of scientific and philosophical approaches to nature and to human beings of the ancients, we can find in writings of the founder of empiricism in modern tradition, who was Francis Bacon. I have already said that Vico argues for providence, and we have to remember that the will of God does not contradict the will of human beings. That means that people are rational enough to behave in right way, but only God knows what is the best to do. So this is the opportunity of Vico to establish the responsibility of the humans for their own history, for their own state, civil or legal institutions, and so forth. And finally, here's a famous saying of Vico, that history does not demonstrate, but it punishes. So we know that the ancients said that historis magistra vitae, or as we can say, history is the teacher of life, but still we know that history never demands for exams, right? It only punishes it only punishes those who does not know their lessons. That is why it is very important to remember that history is not a progressive, not a linear development, by the development in time of certain civilizations that have more or less the same cycles, more or less periods in their history. So his epistemology, Vico's epistemology, is could be formulated as the rules of historical investigation. I also have to address you to a famous book by a very interesting British historian, whose name was Robin George Collingwood. He is The Idea of History, where he argues for Vico's epistemology a lot, and he really shares this point of view and this approach to a historical investigation. So he says that firstly, Vico meant that firstly, the certain period in history have common traits. We have already mentioned that. So then it becomes possible, as far as we establish this idea that it has the common traits, to conclude by analogy from one period to another. We cannot predict, and that is very important, but we can demonstrate it by analogy. So if something happened by these circumstances and in this very situation, that means that we have the possibility to repeat this or that success or failure. So from this point of view, we can say that common periods tend to alternate in the same order. So that means that if we have the period or the age of gods in one history of one civilization, that means that it must be the same period in the history of another. We cannot say that if one has the period of gods, the age of gods, that it can skip the second age of heroes and find itself on the stage or in the age of the human reason. It is impossible. So it is necessary to follow this logic. So if one has this, if one civilization finds itself on this or that stage or period of time, that means that the second stage could be predicted, right? In terms of comprehension of the tendency of history and the logic of history as such. And finally, the third rule of historical investigation of Vico is that history develops not in a circle, but in a spiral. For it never repeats, but enters each new phrase in a different form that is defined by the former development. So this is, I have already explained, right? So if you have this period of time, we could say that the next will be like that, and we know the circumstances. That is why it is very important to have the exact understanding and really the exact knowledge of the language, of the discourse of that, of this or that epoch, because unless we do not have that, unless we are not able to work with the chronicles or the objective demonstrations of that or this or that period of time, we cannot say that what is the stage and what is the circumstance and what is really this, what is the situation of this of that civilization, right? So I have to remember that Vico's epistemology is anti-Cartesian, and the Cartesian one will be discussed a bit later, but we have to mention it because this is the first part of our lecture for today. So this is how people could orient in time. The next part is how people can orient in space. So we are starting talking about the age of discoveries. As I've already said, this is one of the important milestones in the history of development of humans and preliminary Europeans' views about the outer world. So here you can see some maps of the world to compare. Here you have the Strabo's map, which was elaborated in the 1st century AD. So Strabo was a cartographer, the one who tried to systematize, to give the system of all the known Earth's surface by his time. And here we have quite interesting things. So look, this is Europe, and you can see that Europe is quite definite, right? It's quite distinguishing. So we have more or less the same maps nowadays. Asia is completely different from what we know about it now, the same like India. So this is Indian Peninsula. Here is the Arabic Peninsula, so-called Arabia Felix, or happy Arabic countries, right? Libya and Ethiopia are considered to be the Africa as such. In the Roman period of time, when the Mediterranean, or was called Mare Internum, which means the inner sea, or even the Roman lake. because you know that the Roman Empire just embodied, right, made a kind of circle, right, around it. So here we can find completely different view about Africa comparing to what we know now. So we don't have anything like China, or sorry, anything like Japan, or anything like America, just because this part of the world, so near Spain and Gibraltar, really was considered to be the end of the universe, right, the end of the land. And you know that Plato was one of the first people who gave us the description of the Atlantis, the place where the Atlants lived, and he said that after it stopped existing, right? After it died, I mean, the civilization of Atlantis died. Not a single ship can pass through this Gibraltar just because there is no way, right? No further way. So that is why they said that the pillars of Hercules is a metaphor of the very end of the earth, the very end of the universe even. And of course they thought that land, so the earth as such, swims, flows in the ocean. So ocean is round the earth's surface. And here in the very north, this is the land of cynocephals and hyperboreans. So those people who have canine heads, who eat people, who has people who have even canine tails, and they're completely different from the ones we know in Europe, from the ones we know, for example, in Rome or in ancient Greece. Here, as we can see, the Ptolemies map of the world, which is the 2nd century AD, and actually Ptolemies map is not very different from the one of Strabo, but still this was the basis of the views about the outer world for the whole medieval civilization. I hope you remember that the foundation of physical understanding of the world in the period of the Middle Ages was Aristotle's physics, right? Aristotle's approach to our outer world. But still, concerning the sublunar world, right, the outer world, in terms of geography, that was Ptolemy who really defined the trend, and nobody really tried to check if his map is right or wrong, if it is correct or not. So we cannot say that during the medieval period, except probably the Vikings, people were really interested in the outer world, because you remember that people really thought that under, of course, Christian church, the mainly Catholic and Orthodox church, after the Great Schism of 1054, that our terrestrial life, our life on Earth, is something like a blink of an eye, and we have to get prepared to the next world, to the world after our death, right? When we will be judged by our actions and by our thoughts, by our morality. That is why this could be one of the explanations why they didn't really have almost no interest about the outer world. And here is the map of the 16th century done by Gerardus Mercator. So he was the one who elaborated the latitudes and longitudes to depict the Earth's surface on the map, and he was one of the people who tried to create the globe. So you remember that Copernicus published his book on heliocentric system of the universe in 1543, and in 1569 Mercator worked out his map. So here you can see the half globes, right, where we can find America, I mean the South America and North America. Here we can see Africa, more or less the same as we understand it now. A completely different comprehension of Asia and Europe, comparing to what we have in Strabo's and Ptolemy's maps. And this terra incognita, let me say, so terra australis, which actually literally, to translate it literally, that means the south land, which was really something undiscovered until the investigations and discoveries of the Russian sailors like Bellenhausen and Lazarev. So this could be possible only after the first successful circumnavigations, and actually one of the inspirators, one of those who inspired various voyages and discoveries of this perfect age, which started in the 16th century, was Henry the Navigator, or who was the ruler of Portugal, and he actually has the nickname of Navigator, but he never sailed himself. He elaborated the project of how to make the routes to the south, to India, to the new lands in the west, and so forth. And as some authors say, one of the most crucial thing about all these discoveries was the idea to find the spices. So in the medieval time, in the medieval period of history, the feudals could not boast anything but their rich feasts, where we ate a lot, right? Where they drank a lot, but that was nothing special, nothing peculiar. They didn't have any spices unless probably the lauras or something like that, or some just examples of pepper that we can find in Bulgaria, in modern Bulgaria, something like that. So Chinese and Indian and African merchants and representatives were those who really influenced a lot on the very cuisine of Europe, and that is why one of the main and probably one of the most important things that he wanted to find is the way to the lands where the spices really grow, such as pepper, right, such as different others and so forth. That is why India was a kind of the ultimate way where they want to find, right, the so-called Ultima Thule. But still, here we can see the land in terms of, from the point of view of European. So this is how the Europeans understand the world. Just to compare, so this is just a further map. So this is the 17th century, and a lot of the discoveries were taken into consideration. But here is just the example how we can see the world so-called upside down. So in terms of Australia, right? So if Australia became as powerful as Europe did in that time, we could probably see the world like that, right? So you know that Australia is, it has a certain peculiar, right, place in the world. So it really depends. It really depends. So this is just the moral that I wanted to show you today. So concerning Ferdinand Magellan's first circumnavigations, we have to say that it was really an important step in the development of the ideas of the outer world, because he started from Spain, being Portuguese himself. He started from Spain, and he had several ships, which he very motivated crew, because you know that it was really scary to travel further than this part of the world, right, as so-called the Tropic of Cancer, right? And the sailors were afraid of so-called oceans or even seas of oil, which burns, and where awful creatures live, such as Leviathan or Behemoth, as we can say, hippopotamus, right? And few people really wanted to follow these routes. So the Pope had even to claim the forgiveness of all the sins to those who will continue these routes and who will try to create this first circumnavigation. And Magellanists were among those few people who really believed that there is the possibility to come to India not by the eastern way, but by the western way. So this is actually the Cape of Good Hope, as it is called in England. And this is one of the most important ideas in terms of the views of the Europeans of how we can come to India, because this was a kind of the border, a kind of frontier. And Bartholomew Diaz probably was the first person who sails around the Cape of Good Hope and showed that there is nothing like the sea of oil, no awful creatures. We will not fall from our plane surface, but we will just sail further, and we will get somewhere, right? So Magellanes tried to escape this route, and he sailed from Spain to the coast of South America, and this was actually the first time in history when the Europeans saw the penguins. So they went here, and they really tried to follow the way, follow the coast, and at last, the crew of Magellan lost their hope that they can swim through any. They lost their hope that we can get to another ocean than Atlantic, right? So Magellan probably was the first person who really had this hope, and after years of investigation, he finally got this strait, as we know nowadays as Strait of Magellan, and he went to Pacific Ocean, and Magellan was the one who called this ocean Pacific because he found still weather there, comparing to the Atlantic Ocean which he escaped from. Then he moved further, and that was in 1521, and he came to the Philippines, where he died in the battle with the pagan inhabitants of that land. But some ships of his flotilla, of his fleet, continued under Del Cano, his devoted friend and one of the members of the crew. And they finally came in 1522 back to Spain. And one of the interesting things that they really discovered were not only the new lands, but also that they lost 2 days. So they had the person who fixed so each day in his diary. And after 3 years of voyage, they found that 2 days lost because they didn't mean the difference between certain parts of the world. So now we know that to fly, for example, from Moscow to New York, we have to put another time in our clocks, right? In our watches. So they didn't know that, and that was an interesting thing that they really discovered, not only how to orient in space, but only how to orient in time, right? And here's the map of the second circumnavigation under Sir Francis Drake, which happened and also took 3 years, as you can see. It happened in 1577. It started in 1577, and they came from Great Britain. So they followed Magellan's logic, but they went not only the Strait of Magellan, but they also found the biggest strait, the widest strait, to the south of South America. So in between this cape and the very northern cape of Antarctica. So this strait is named after Francis Drake, so the Strait of Drake. And they followed sailing straight at the coast of South America, then to North America, and in 1579, and you see that they needed only 1 year to come here, right? Whereas Magellan really needed 2 years just to find the strait. So in 1579, they continued their way, and they also discovered Polynesia and some other islands in this part of the world. And in 1580, they started their way back round the Cape of Good Hope and the Cape Horn in Africa, and finally they got back to London. So they say that Francis Drake, who was actually a pirate, a famous pirate of his era, so-called flibustier, right, got his title of Sir. So he became a knight on his very ship. So when where the Queen Elizabeth I learned that Francis Drake came back and came successfully with different demonstrations and different maps of his route, she wanted to devote him into knightship on his very ship, right? And Francis Drake is considered to be one of the heroes of the English nation. You know that there are different heroes of different nations in history and mythology of Europe. So Francis Drake, they say that Francis Drake has a certain drum which nowadays is in one of the cathedrals in London. And the Englishmen think that when a certain danger, so there is certain danger for them, such as war or a certain catastrophe, this drum starts just drumming, starts booming, let me say, right? So they say that they heard this kind of drum sound when the Second World War began. So nobody knows if it's true or not, but this is interesting legend, isn't it? After people realized that it is possible to get the principal demonstration of how they live on the Earth's surface and how the very lands and nations could be depicted in certain maps, and we can use them to travel around the world. Of course, the idea of rationality as a certain engine of the development of human history and human culture as such came into power. And that is why it is important to say some words about the establishment of the academies in the modern period of time. So in the time of 17th century, we find that many scientific societies occurred, and probably one of the eldest regular academies in the European world is Leopoldina, or the Academy of Leopoldina, which was established in the Holy Roman Empire. So now we could say that it is German, by Leopold I. That is why it was given his name. So he was one of the rulers of Holy Roman Empire. So it occurred. It happened in 1652. So the famous Royal Society in London, which is probably one of the most influential scientific societies in modern history, was established in 1660, and the full name of this institution is the President, Council and Fellows of the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge. So this is very illustrious how in this part of how the very academics understood their aims and purposes. So primarily they wanted to explain how we live in our physical world, right? They do not have any metaphysical aims. They didn't want to explain something historically or culturally. They wanted to study nature. And probably this is the time when science gets its definition, its meaning of the investigation of nature, right? So you know that in the English language, science has, the first meaning of science is this, right? The investigation of nature. In 1666, in London, you know that in London in 1666 there was the Great Fire, after which Sir Christopher Wren had to reconstruct the capital of Great Britain almost completely. And in France they established the French Academy of Sciences, which really works which has a quite interesting history. So it worked until Napoleon until the Great French Revolution, which happened in 1789, and the Jacobins really closed it because they didn't need any people who thought completely different for what is true in their point of view. So he was Napoleon I, famous Napoleon Bonaparte, who re-established this French Academy, and now we know that it is also one of the most representative, let me say, institution in terms of academic societies of nowadays. Of course, here we have the Real Academia of Spain, and real we have to understand in terms of royal, right? The Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, so the Russian Academy of Sciences, was established in 1724, and he was Peter the Great, or Peter the First, who subscribed the paper which demands this need. They say that he had he really consulted with famous philosopher and mathematician Leibniz how to establish the university and the academy as such. And you know that many academics of the 18th and then the 19th century in the Russian Empire were the foreigners, right? First of all, they were the Germans, then they were Frenchmen, the Swiss people, such as, for example, Leonhard Euler and many others. And of course, it's interesting to mention the Swedish Academy, which was established in 1786, because Swedish Academy is famous for granting the famous scientists and other people, right, like the writers or just the presidents and different other important and influential persons with the Nobel Prize, right? So here is the first. So this is the first building of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. So you can go to the embankment, right? The university embankment of our city and watch it yourself. And here is the Swedish Academy where some Nobel Prizes are awarding. So what are the functions of scientific societies? You know that there is an anecdote about the universities, that the first universities were established to give the scientists the possibility to be buried as people, right? So to have good places on cemetery. Some people say that this is just a joke, but still, of course, the scientific societies and the universities, the scientific schools, and so forth, are very important in terms of the institutional approach, the institutional aspects of the arranging and the very arrangement of scientific process. So that is why we say that the academies and the scientific societies have strict and very important influence on the arrangement of system of views on the subject and development of certain science. So if we think that we have a certain trend in science or in scholarship as such, and we want to say that this or that person is really important for our scientific society and want to grant him, we say that we share his values and we share his approach, and we say that he is or she is the one who makes the big impact, right, in the very impact and contribution in the very understanding of a certain scientific field. That is why it is also important to remember that one of the functions, the second probably, the function of scientific society is that universality, it obtains a certain universality which scientists take into consideration in their investigations and evaluation of their colleagues by applying general criteria in the rules of relevance and demonstration. Of course, we cannot skip such a point as elaboration of the ethos of science, so a certain affiliation or membership and so forth. I have already said that the full name of Royal Society of London includes the President, the Council, and the Fellows. That is why it is important that in our scientific field, in our scientific world, we not only have the certain degrees, but a certain affiliation, right? If you say that, for example, somebody belongs to this or that university or to this or that fellowship or society, that means to say about his ethos, a certain modus vivendi and modus operandi, right? So the way of, not only the way of life, but also the way of acting. By the way, it is the same as to say that somebody was dropped out. For example, you know that Steve Jobs dropped out from Stanford, right? And it is also very illustrious. Or Bill Gates, right, dropped out from Harvard. It's also quite illustrious. So they also think, well, this is a commonplace actually to think that all members of scientific society share a certain paradigm, and as a consequence they share a certain evaluation system, and also we can say about the sharing of traditions and the ethical approaches to this or that demonstration or this or that experiment, and even you know that we have some scientific morality, let me say, in terms of the certain criteria of how the papers must be published or how you must quote this or that person and so forth. And here is just some examples of famous people who really established the certain paradigm. So here we can find Lavoisier, right? The person who discovered oxygen as a certain chemical element. And here our famous Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, who was the first Russian scientist to be granted with the Nobel Prize in medicine and physiology. So finally, we have to mention that those people who share the fellowships and who share the paradigms and the values of this or that scientific society really form the scientific elite. So you know that the election of a certain scientist on the position of a member of the council or the president, or for example a doctor of honoris causa and so forth, this all works for the certain scientific society, right? The certain university, the certain school. Many people, many societies look for famous scientists just as a certain shop window, right, to put it, to say that this person belongs to us, right? We can affiliate this person to us, and this is a kind of the visiting card. Of course, it is very important to mention the awards that we have for the most outstanding fellows that can grant their achievements and evaluate their goals. So here is the example of the Nobel Prize. This is just the situation of the very beginning of awarding the person, right? You know that the one who awards the person is the king or the queen of Sweden, but the one who is awarded could be elected by those who has already been awarded, right? So the Nobel laureate of the previous ages could recommend this or that person to this position, to this award. Also, the universities could recommend, the Swedish Academy and different academies of sciences could recommend this or that person to be granted and to be awarded by this important thing, right, but this important prize. And of course, as far as you are awarded, you have to give a biographical note about the fellow, which would be included in the certain manual or encyclopedia and so forth. And that is how the society works, right? It popularizes the certain fellows to say that they really exist, right? So this is the principle of openness, let me say, right? So it is not a certain esoteric society, but it is completely open to anybody who deserves the appreciation, right? Another interesting example of such an award is, of course, the Fields Award. You know that we don't have Nobel Prize in mathematics, as the legend said, because Alfred Nobel's wife split him up with the mathematician, but nobody knows if it's true. But still, we have the Fields Prize, and many mathematicians are granted with this highest award in the field. Of course, you know that scientists participate in the editing and publications of respected and recognized oeuvre, or folia, as we can say, so different issues, both in scientific and general, so popular scientific fields. They are not restricted in their own area, but they want more people to know about their activity, about their investigations, to know more about the certain elaborations and establishing the new theories and new paradigms, probably scientific revolutions and so forth. That is why the publication is important. And of course, the consequence of this development is high qualifications and demands for quite high qualifications, such as the famous famous H index, also called the Hirsch index of publications and events. Those who went to different events, such as conferences and congresses, understand that it is important to remember about the international character of scientific cooperation, right? We cannot say that we really can establish or develop the national or restrictly, right, national science. So we have to share our developments and share our investigations with the outer world. So an interesting example of a person who was granted as the Dr. Honoris Causa was a famous translator and also the children's poet, Kornei Chukovsky, who is famous in Russia very much. And he was one of those who was not scientist as such, but he was a famous author. He was the man of letters, and finally he popularized the very spirit of English tales and English fairy tales and English culture in the Russian Empire and of the late years and in the Soviet Union. So here you can see the famous cap, right, of a certain academy. So here we see him in the mantle and the cap of Oxford University. And it's interesting that Kornei Chukovsky studied at school in the times of Alexander III, an emperor who published a famous law, and let me say notorious law, which called the cookwoman's on cookwoman's children. So that meant that the kitchen woman's children, sorry. That meant that those who are not nobility and those who do not have enough money to study in certain gymnasiums or lyceums or high-ranked schools, they must be expelled. One of those who were expelled was Kornei Chukovsky, and he studied English by his own, so he is a self-taught man, let us say. It's interesting to mention just a kind of a historical anecdote that Alexander I, the Russian Emperor Alexander I, Alexander II, and Kornei Chukovsky were the doctors of honoris causa of Oxford University. And the one who prohibited his studying at school, Alexander III, was not a doctor of honoris causa. Right? So this is just a kind of an anecdote from this kind of scientific life. And I have to thank you for your attention for this lecture, and if you have any questions, you are welcome to ask. Okay, so anyway, we can make it eye to eye, right? So thank you so much, and hope to see you next time.